Some of the other considerations, as we talked about, again, these requests are huge, but take a look at what some of the power supply needs of these cities are alone. Aberdeen is only 70 megawatts, but Bismarck-Mandan, 240 megawatts, Fargo-Moorhead's 560, Sioux Falls is 600, Dickinson 100, and Minot 135. These loads are more than entire cities that are being processed with one project. It took over a century for us to build the current system that we have in the ground today, and we are being asked to more than double that in a very short period of time. The totality of those 12 that has come to us total 6,000 megawatts. And to just give you a little bit of comparison, our all-time system peak was hit this January, and that was 5,150 megawatts. These 12 projects have totaled more than that.
and what we can do collectively to protect our families and neighbors from their impact. My name is Lori Williams, and I'm the director of Sierra Club's Grid Decarbonization Campaign, and I'm your MC today. For those of you who are less familiar with the Sierra Club, we are one of the nation's oldest and largest grassroots environmental organizations. We amplify the power of our millions of members and supporters to defend everyone's right to a healthy world. There are serious challenges ahead of us: a warming climate, rising energy costs, and powerful special interests undermining basic protections of our air and water. There's no time to waste in coming together in support of new solutions, which is why Sierra Club is bringing people together to build the most powerful and effective environmental movement the world has ever seen, and why we're here today. From securing protection for parks and monuments, winning passage of the Clean Air Act and Endangered Species Act, putting over 280 coal plants on the path to replacement with clean energy, to securing the right of every kid in America to visit a national park, we have an unmatched record of success and impact. We have chapters in every state who live, support, and advocate for our values. Our view on data centers is simple: they should do no harm. Do no harm to neighboring communities where they're built. Do no harm to hardworking families already struggling to pay their electric bills. And do no harm to our worsening climate crisis due to burning fossil fuels. Based on the remarkable turnout for this webinar, we know that the issue of data center growth and its impacts on your community's electric bills and our climate are very much on people's minds. Today, we'll hear from Jeremy and Paige. Jeremy works for the National Sierra Club as our principal advisor on climate and energy, and he's our resident data center expert. Paige works for our Virginia chapter as its digital communications and data center lead. Virginia is ground zero for data center development in the world. Thank you all so much for taking your time to be here. Now I'll hand it over to Jeremy to get us started.
Thank you so much, Lori. It's really great to be here this afternoon. And again, thanks so much for joining us. So why are we talking about data centers and big tech? Well, for some of you may remember near the end of 2022 when ChatGPT first really went public. It didn't take long for investors and technology companies to decide that they just wanted in on the artificial intelligence tech. And what sits behind that technology turns out is, well, a lot of data centers. And as we're going to get into in a few minutes, these things are huge. Within a few months of AI coming online, we really started getting approached by utilities, sometimes in regulatory proceedings and sometimes directly, who started telling us that they were getting nervous about the number of data center requests that were coming to their system. And it didn't take too long before those first utilities started making announcements that they might roll back some of their energy transition plans or aim to just build a lot more gas. And what started as a trickle of announcements pretty quickly turned into a flood. Today, we can't talk to a utility, regulator, or state policy official about energy issues without data centers showing up and being the first thing to come into the discussion, each and every time. For those of you following the flood of executive orders emerging from the White House, this administration has not been shy about using data centers and big tech as one of the primary reasons for pushing back on environmental and consumer protections. So today, we're going to be digging in on what's actually happening and what you can do about it. We're going to start off by talking about the scale of data center build out that's happening right now, what observers are projecting, and where it might be going in the next couple of years. But before we get there, I think it's really helpful to just get a sense of the scale, because what we're going to be talking about here are facilities that are gigawatts in size. In other words, these things might use 1 billion watts or trillions of watt hours every year. And that's just a hard thing to get your head around. All right, so what's a gigawatt anyways? Let's start off by looking at your neighborhood. A single megawatt of power is enough capacity to keep a neighborhood of around 400 homes and a school running, so sort of like what you see in this image on the right side. 10 megawatts might be enough to keep a small town around 4,000 homes and small businesses and city services trickling and just moving on. But to really get up to the scales that we're talking about with modern data centers, we have to look at an entire city. The city of Orlando, Florida peaks out at around 1,200 megawatts, or just over a gigawatt of energy. That's enough power to power 200,000 homes, 10,000 businesses and schools, and 5,000 large customers, including an international airport. So when you hear us talking about a gigawatt or a utility talking about a gigawatt, think Orlando. All right, let's turn over to data centers like this one just outside of Dulles Airport in Northern Virginia, owned by Digital Realty. This facility is estimated to consume about 270 megawatts. So 4 of these is a gigawatt, Orlando. And it's not alone. Data centers with capacities of a gigawatt or more are being proposed all over. And while Paige is going to talk a little bit more about this later, I want you to notice those boxes on the backside of the data centers too. Each of those boxes is a semi-truck sized backup diesel generator. And today's data centers have dozens of those, to hundreds of them. There are enough backup generators in this picture to run a small utility. All right, so where are these data centers actually going across the United States? Well, this is a map of where we think data centers are in the US today. As of June 2025, there are an estimated 43 gigawatts worth of data centers online in the US, 43 Orlandos. For clarification, we're just looking at non-cryptocurrency data centers. So this isn't including the raft of data centers that are trying to mine Bitcoin. The red dots that are on here are data centers that are owned by what are generally called the hyperscalers, or Apple, Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft. These are the companies that run web services, a lot of AI, and build their own data centers for their own uses. In orange, I'm showing what are called leased data centers, who rent rack space to small and medium-sized businesses, or increasingly rent entire buildings for data center users. A lot of the time, those big users are also the hyperscalers. Around half the capacity online today is owned by hyperscalers, and the other half are owned by leased data centers with companies like Digital Realty, also QTS, Equinix, and a lot of other real estate companies coming into this space. What you start to see in this map is that data centers arrive in clusters. This happens for a few reasons. Data centers send each other a lot of information, so being closer helps reduce that cost of sending data back and forth. And places that make it easy to build one data center might make it easy to bring others online also. And you don't see it on this map, but about half the capacity here was built in just the last 3 years. But let's look at where we're going in just the next few years. The folks who track credible data center announcements think that we might hit more than 100 gigawatts of data center by 2030, more than doubling today's capacity in just 5 years. And that's a shocking number. Translated, between 15 to 16% of US electricity consumption would be going to serve non-cryptocurrency data centers. What we're seeing in this map are 2 new things. First, a lot of the current data center hubs keep growing, but we're also starting to see the emergence of new data center hubs in swaths across the South, from South Carolina to Mississippi, and in places like Missouri and Minnesota. But what really stands out here are just how big a lot of the new data centers are that are going in. There are hundreds of megawatts. One of the things that you can't see on this map, again, is that a really sizable portion of the yellow bar on the right are from companies who basically have no history of building data centers. About 1/3 of the proposed data centers on this map, like 20 gigawatts worth, are from real estate developers who have gone from under 100 megawatts of operational capacity today and expect to be in the gigawatt level in the next couple of years, meaning there's a lot of speculation going on out there. Well, that map might be a little hard to get our fingers wrapped around. So let's look at this in a simplified manner. What I'm showing here are dark blue circles, the relative size of each data center today. And the rings around each of those, I'm showing the planned and under construction data centers for that state. For calibration, we estimate that Virginia today is at around 8.9 gigawatts, but could be about 28 gigawatts by 2030. But Virginia isn't the only state getting big. This is also a map that shows us that there are 23 states headed towards more than a gigawatt of planned data center capacity by 2030. Again, each time you see a gigawatt, you should be thinking about a decently sized city added to the electric grid, another Orlando, and all of this is happening in the next 5 years. Now, 100 gigawatts worth of data center, 15% of US electricity, is pretty startling. But even that number pales in comparison to what utilities are being told comes from potential customers. I want you to bear in mind that almost none of this data is published by states, much less our federal government. We only know about these data center proposals from local announcements, siting boards, and some utility filings, and we use a service to help us pin these down. But there's basically zero transparency around where this growth is happening or who's behind it. The utilities are telling us that they're getting data center developers pounding on their doors every day, and the numbers that they're hearing are just jaw-dropping. And they tell us that we're probably sitting on a pretty big bubble. All right, so we ran a deep dive on major utilities that have some form of public filing or investor decks. And while many of those utilities don't want to disclose who's been knocking at the door, we found that there are 23 utilities that together disclosed economic pipeline of over 700 gigawatts worth of data center interest. Just for a little bit of perspective, if all of those data centers were actually built, they would use as much as the entire United States economy, plus another 30% on top. All right, we think a lot of the interest that we're seeing is coming from real estate developers who don't really have a history of building data centers. And we see that playing out state by state, where small new companies are snapping up land and asking utilities to hook them up to the grid. And in a lot of cases, we're finding that they don't really have customers lined up to actually use those data centers. But that speculation and the idea that there's almost an unbounded amount of data center demand is leading utilities and policymakers to think that they basically need to throw out the safeguards that make room for that speculation. And that's where we're starting to go off the rails. So we've been making the claim that unabated growth of data centers is harming ratepayers, our climate targets, and our local health. And we want to dive into that just a little more here. I want to start with the claim that data center risk increasing energy costs and increasing risk for ratepayers, and we see that playing out in 3 different ways. First, the price of data centers coming online mean that utilities are leaning a lot more on expensive gas and coal plants because that's what they have available right now. Areas with large numbers of data centers are already seeing the cost of strained grids reflected on customers. And when we model out what utility costs look like going forward, we're seeing that they end up having to build a lot of new infrastructure. Virginia, for example, estimated that growing data center demand would add billions to local electricity costs. And not all of that cost is going to be shouldered by data center customers. Second, a lot of new infrastructure utilities are going to build for data centers has typically been considered a common good. Things that we all use, like transmission to serve all customers. But what if that transmission was specifically designed to serve a cluster of data centers? Should that still be considered a common good? Most of the utilities that we're looking at don't have a good way of differentiating these costs. And third, there's a very real risk that the bubble pops and a bunch of the speculators that we're talking about just go belly up. Maybe there really isn't a market for all of these data centers and the AI boom plateaus. What happens if a utility has spent a lot of money building a system to serve really big customers who are no longer there? Unfortunately, there are a few cases in which utilities have lost big customers, and the result is that costs go up for everyone else. Unfortunately, a lot of the new expensive infrastructure that's getting built to meet data center demands isn't particularly clean, and that's where we get this next really huge problem. We think that data centers are starting to kill climate targets. That might sound like a really bold statement, but we're watching climate progress face real threats today, and not a small amount of that is attributable to data centers, and ultimately the technology companies that are pushing this massive expansion. And again, we see this playing out at 3 different scales. First, we're watching utilities wind back their decarbonization efforts with the rise of data centers. And that started even before the Trump administration decided that it was great for us to have asthma again. We've had an unfortunate number of utilities tell us that they're slowing their transition efforts, bringing huge gas plants online, and keeping uneconomic coal plants online just to serve data centers. And this isn't maybe just the related thing. You know, in Louisiana, Meta took the extraordinary step of being able to negotiate for a utility to build 2 massive gas plants to run their AI training center. Second, we're seeing states with climate targets starting to wind back those targets. Just 3 weeks ago, North Carolina decided that it would let Duke Energy blow past its 2030 goals, all in the name of building data centers, and Virginia appears to be toying with the same idea. And then finally, the Trump administration has been thrilled to just let technology companies and data centers take the blame for his environmental and ratepayer protection rollbacks. We're counting at least 6 executive orders to date that use data centers as a foil to roll back safeguards and try to slam the door shut on renewable energy. And of course, the ridiculous part is that the administration has already identified that if we build all of these data centers and don't build a lot of renewable energy fast, we're going to be in a jam. So I'm going to pass this over to Paige now to talk about some of the community impacts that we're seeing on the ground. Paige?
Thanks, Jeremy. So what does this look like on the ground? What does this look like locally? Virginia is the data center capital of the world. And what we're seeing is that data centers are really overpromising and under-delivering across our state. They're really hurting us more than helping us. And so one of the ways that we're seeing this is with our health. As Jeremy mentioned, each data center uses dozens to hundreds of diesel generators for backup power. Those are massive tractor trailer sized diesel generators. And diesel fumes are really bad for our health. They increase rates of cancer and respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. And specifically, diesel generators emit pollution that we can't see, and that pollution hurts children most. And the problem is that data centers and their backup diesel generators are often sited near schools and homes, and we have little to no regulation saying that they can't do that. And so now we have these diesel generators that are harming our health that are close to our communities. Tech companies are really downplaying the impacts of these diesel generators. In Northern Virginia, we have 5,000 plus diesel generators. And in 2022, Loudoun County, which is in Northern Virginia, nearly allowed them to run 24/7 because it was going to be a hot summer. We are expecting to see this more and more as things get hotter across our country and in our world. And we're also seeing that in Virginia, they're running it for things like emergency purposes when it is a really hot day and they need to kick on backup power. And so we are seeing it more and more play out. And they're huge. Think about 5,000 diesel generators in one place. If they all kicked on at the same time because we had a blackout, it would be like seeing a huge plume of smoke from space. That's how much pollution would be emitted into the air. It's a real problem for people's health. The other issue that we're seeing is transparency. Jeremy spoke on this a little bit, but in Virginia, we're seeing it in real time. We are lacking so much data on where is the water coming from for local projects. What is the energy demand? How much does an individual data center need of our energy? And what is that energy going to be? What are the number of backup generators that are going to be on a data center that's going to be right next to my home? What are the energy prices? How is my electric bill going to go up? And which tech companies are moving into my neighborhood? Is this data center going to be Meta, Amazon, whoever it might be, Google? And so these are all questions that we really don't know the answer to until a data center has already been approved. And at that point, people really have no part of that process. And so even our lead data center chair lead researcher for our report that we released recently, Ann Bennett, really did research for months to try to get answers to all these questions. And while we have a good idea of what the impact is going to be, we could not get that full picture because so much information cannot be found. And so I'm really wondering, what can we expect to see if we had the full picture? And I would imagine it's going to be a pretty stark image. And the other thing with transparency is that we don't know how much these data centers individually are paying for their electric bills because they have private contracts with our utility in Virginia and across the nation where they agree on an energy price, and we don't get to see that. So now we're in a situation where data center tech companies, these trillion-dollar tech companies, are able to negotiate their energy prices and families aren't. And then we have the problem of cost at the local level. And we are projected to face a doubling of our electric bills and probably even more due to new gas burning plants across our state that our utility has said they need to build in order to power data centers and data centers alone. So people are paying for this build out of new gas plants. Whenever there is a new gas plant proposed in Virginia, that the price of that is passed on to ratepayers. So if it's a $2 billion gas plant that they need to build, we are paying for that, whether it ends up being used or not. It doesn't seem fair to me that we are shouldering the cost, families are shouldering the cost of this energy infrastructure when trillion-dollar tech companies could easily be paying for it. And we'll pass it back to Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Paige. And we really are hearing similar stories to what Paige is telling across many of the states that we operate in. So one thing I want to clarify here is that the harms that we're seeing are incurred by the unmitigated and unconstrained growth, or in a lot of cases, really just the projected growth of data centers. And we know that there are a lot of services that are offered by the technologies that are enabled having data centers like this stream here today. But what we're seeing today appears to be the speculative growth without much understanding of if there's a fundamental market that actually exists for these data centers. And both the rate of expansion and the big gamble are driving poor decisions in the electric sector. The speculation isn't driven only by the money flowing into technology companies. A lot of it's driven by what we might think of as public subsidies for this industry too. So let's dig into those for a moment. First, a number of utilities have what are called economic incentive rates. These are rates that are designed to attract large customers to a utility service territory. And in many cases, they've been approved by state utility regulators. An incentive rate is meant to attract economic development like factories and businesses, and basically is a discount to what big customers would have otherwise paid. The idea of an economic incentive rate is that it can bring in large customers who have historically helped pay down some of the fixed costs of running a system, like existing transmission and overhead, and didn't really cost that much more to serve, just burning a little bit more fuel. And the theory was that those customers would bring down everybody else's costs. Well, that sort of goes out the window when your new customers are so big that you have to build whole new generators and transmission systems just to serve them. And those incentive rates attract big data centers in really big clusters. Then you have preferential treatment for data center customers and other large loads. I'm going to highlight Virginia here because, again, it's got a bit of a track record with data centers. What you're seeing over here on this graph on the left is the electric consumption for both residential customers, in blue on the bottom, and commercial customers like data centers in red on the top. What you can see here is that between 2014 and 2024, the amount of electricity consumed by commercial customers in Dominion, which is the utility that serves Virginia, its territory increased by 43%. That's basically data centers coming onto the system, and I expect that we're going to see that number climb enormously in the next few years as the new data centers come online as well. But in the meantime, residential customers didn't change much. But if we flip this graph over to look at how much those customers paid, what we see is that not only do commercial customers pay less for their electricity overall, but while residential rates increased by 30%, commercial customer rates increased by less than inflation. These are the kinds of price signals that drive data centers to Virginia, and a willingness to have other customers foot the bill. The other thing that we're seeing are tax breaks, again, meant to drive new economic development. And again, the idea of these tax breaks historically has been to drive industries that would bring jobs and hopefully more tax revenue into states and jurisdictions. But we're increasingly seeing that these tax breaks, when applied to an industry with an extraordinary drive, are driving speculation and probably costing states and localities a lot of lost tax revenue. The folks over at Good Jobs First recently published a study examining tax breaks for state and local sales, property and use tax exemptions, and they found billions that were being provided to data center customers from public taxes. Okay, I'm going to flip over to some subsidies that are a lot less visible to you and I, but they're really important to the data center customers. The first are utilities that are willing to basically skip what might be considered the standard checks and balances in order to rush in new data centers. A lot of utilities create what are called public-facing long-term resource plans to figure out how they're going to stage new generation and new transmission and figure out what they actually need in order to be able to serve their customers. But we've seen an unfortunate trend in the last 2 years where some utilities have started to skip that public part and are pressuring their regulators to allow them to build gas and extend coal plants to serve data centers. The second major giveaway that the grids are providing to data centers is allowing them to change the rules of how electricity systems are built altogether. Today, we have over 2,000 gigawatts of renewable energy and storage waiting for permission to get built. Again, equivalent of 2,000 Orlandos just waiting to get built in what's called the interconnection queue line. That's like 6.5 times the amount of renewable energy that we actually have online today. Just an enormous backlog. And some of those projects have been waiting for years. But when data centers started coming online, some of the biggest grid operators started to looking to skip over all that clean energy and started to look at just bringing gas online faster. While we need to move that line faster, skipping gas to the front is not the way to do it. And the third major giveaway is being able to rely on lax pollution standards for those backup diesel generators that Paige was talking about. Each of those data centers has dozens or hundreds of these generators attached to them. And they're not supposed to run very often, but they have a huge potential to emit. Our friends over at the Piedmont Environmental Council found 11,000 megawatts of permitted diesel generators for data centers alone in Northern Virginia. That's enough capacity to meet all of Arizona's summer peak, like entire state. But big generators have to abide by strict pollution standards, and thousands of these small generators don't. And they don't have to report their emissions either. So we know there are a huge number of data centers clamoring to get online, and that they're impacting our electric system, imposing costs on the rest of us, and using public subsidies to get there. And we don't have a lot of transparency on who's building what or who's responsible. But there's some good news here. We're not entirely without some common sense tools to push back to protect ratepayers and climate and communities. As a general principle, we think that the growth of data centers should be centered around the construct of do no harm. It's pretty straightforward. We shouldn't be allowing harm to come to ratepayers, livable climate, or the communities that are being asked to host data centers. And we can do this from both a top-down policy regulation standpoint and a bottom-up advocacy standpoint. When it comes to ratepayer protection, the first really obvious piece is that we need to get rid of economic development rates and tax exemptions for data centers. These are unequivocally driving speculation, and worse, they're transferring money from everyday Americans to some of the richest corporations in the world. Next, we need to set up electricity rates for data centers that protect residential customers and small businesses. Today, data centers can come into just about any utility territory and demand that they be served, which may require the utility serving them to deploy hundreds of millions of dollars to build generators and transmission to serve them. But if those data centers don't actually find customers, or the data center doesn't actually materialize, it's all of the other ratepayers who are on the hook. Over the last year, an increasing number of utilities have started to look at new rate structures for large load customers called large load tariffs. And these insulate the utility and other customers from some of that risk, and that's really pretty needed. Paige, do you want to take over some of the local?
Yeah, at the local level, when it comes to local revenue, the theme of data centers overpromising and underdelivering holds true. We hear things about how much money a data center is going to bring into a locality, but the truth of the matter is that there are things like a data center leasing to a bank. In Virginia, that's happened, where the number that's been promised to the locality has ended up being a lot less because banks are actually tax-free. And so that money didn't come to fruition how we thought that it would. And that hurts a community that's relying on that income. And then the other issue that we're seeing are things like lowering nearby property values. We have to take that into account when we have data centers coming in and saying, well, we're bringing this revenue. Yeah, but what are we losing as a result of this development? And the other side of it is this promise of jobs. But oftentimes the reality of the jobs is that they, a lot of the time, aren't local and they're not long lasting. It could be a temporary construction job. And what we know about these construction jobs in Virginia and what we're seeing is that they're actually construction companies that are outside of that locality. So how is that locality directly benefiting on the job front? And we're finding it's not truly what we thought, what we were promised. Again, overpromise, underdeliver.
Thanks, Paige. When it comes to the harm to our climate goals, the high-level policy is also actually pretty straightforward. At a bare minimum, we need to make sure that the utilities have in place opportunities for the technology companies that they're working with to actually invest in the renewable energy and storage that they say that they've wanted. If you read any sustainability report from the hyperscalers and the large leased data center providers, they all claim that they're looking to invest in renewables and meet their energy requirements. So let's make sure that utilities actually have the tools to allow those customers to pay for the clean energy they say they need, and let's actually have them hold to those commitments. So maybe just as importantly, let's require data centers and utilities to actually invest in renewable energy with the money that the data centers are bringing to the table. This is a multi-trillion-dollar industry that's willing to spend extraordinary amounts of money on getting data centers online quickly. So let's make sure that the right level of investment is actually flowing to a livable climate and de-risking other customers from gas and coal prices. We can either build firm renewable portfolio standards or just build mandatory clean requirements into utility contracts.
Yeah, and while a lot of what we can do to protect our climate is happening on the state level, and that is where the focus is, there are still things that we can do at the local level. There is an opening for limiting the polluting diesel backup power. That's a real thing that a board of supervisors could work on. There are things like buffer distances that, when I say buffer, I mean between a data center and a home or a community, you can build trees. You can ensure that they are building things that also help with buffering between the community and the data center, but are helping our environment too. And those are real things that can happen at the local level as far as climate goes.
Those impacts of those diesel generators isn't really only a local issue, but is also a huge gap in state and federal permitting with really massive implications for public health. The fact that data centers can just rush through hundreds of megawatts of diesel generators and not face the same permitting requirements as similarly sized fossil fuel plants is clearly a loophole that needs to get closed. And in far too many states, the use of those generators doesn't even have to be reported. The records are kept by the data centers themselves rather than by public health officials. And if one thing hasn't otherwise come through here from what Paige has been talking about and where I've been going, we need clarity and transparency on where the data center build out is happening. This growth in our electric sector is possibly one of the single largest jumps in electricity consumption in the last half century. And we have no state or federal reporting requirements showing us where that build out is happening or who's paying for it. And that leaves communities vulnerable to sudden floods of data centers without an awful lot of tools in their belts to understand the implications.
The dilemma that we face will be entertaining these new large loads popping up very suddenly, requiring far more electricity than the system can quickly accommodate in certain areas. And they can be set up with no public planning and no notification of other utilities or consumers who could get hit by increased costs. So imagine if that data center, which I talked about, that caused that spike for MDU customers, imagine if that had been 2,000 megawatts instead of 200 megawatts. There really was no public planning or discussion of that before it went in.
We have seen that when people are getting involved on the data center projects that are being proposed, they are moving the needle. They are making denials happen when data centers are not what the community wants them to be. And that's happened in multiple places across our state. It's happened in Chesapeake, Virginia. It's happened in Chesterfield, Virginia. It's happened in Charles City County. And while that in Charles City County was just a deferral vote, it was a huge deal because we had 80 community members show up, speak up, and say, we don't want this project. It is 50 feet from the nearest home. It is 100 feet from hundreds of homes in Charles City County, which might not mean nothing to you. It's a beautiful town in Virginia. And they fought back. And the Board of Supervisors said, we hear you. We are going to defer this vote. That vote is coming up soon. Stay tuned. But it's a big deal that when this community comes together, when community members come together, that's how we get the decisions that we want to see. That's how decision makers are erring on the side of, hey, maybe we should listen to the people who elected us to these positions. And so you are not helpless. And while what we've just given you is a lot of information, it's a lot of detailed information. What I want you to know and what I want people to know at the local level is that you do not need to be an expert. You don't need to be an expert. You just need to have your story because your values, where you live, your community, that matters. That should matter to the people that represent you. And when you bring those stories forward, that's when we see these wins more and more.
Thanks so much, Paige. So Paige is really pointing to this idea that we are not powerless in this space. And our collective work on the ground is really starting to make a difference in the way that data centers get sited and how they interact with our power sector. In June, Sierra Club and a few allies, including Amazon Employees for Climate Justice, League of Conservation Voters, Public Citizen, and together signed a full-page ad that we took out in San Francisco Chronicle and the Seattle Times, calling on the largest tech companies to power their data centers under the following conditions: 100% clean energy, and clean capacity, no new gas-burning power plants, and no delayed coal plant retirements. We called on Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Meta to honor their commitments to eliminate greenhouse gases and put their money where their climate goals are. And since we put out that open letter, we've had dozens of nonprofit organizations throughout the country join that letter and demand climate and ratepayer accountability. And you can join this movement too. You can help us tell big technology companies that our electric bills, climate, and health won't be sacrificed for their power needs. You can either scan that QR code on the left, or we're going to be dropping a link in the chat. And there should be a link below in the recording as well to sign on to our petition to the big tech companies. We're demanding in this petition that they take common sense steps to protect us and protect our livable climate. And when you sign on, we're going to also connect you to opportunities to move the needle in your state. And we're going to ask you to please share this around. Finally, we'd appreciate
Your voice, your future, Town Hall. Thank you for joining us for this Fox 45 News, Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall. I'm Mackenzie Frost. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at the controversy surrounding the Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project. The transmission line would cut through Baltimore, Carroll, and Frederick counties. It could use eminent domain to take people's properties. While developers say it's necessary to prevent black and brownouts, others call the transmission line an extension cord from Pennsylvania to data centers in Virginia with no benefit to Marylanders.
That's the hardest part to swallow, that this project is not for Maryland. You know, I can only speculate that they picked the line and then backed into the alternatives because, you know, when we were doing our search, you certainly didn't find any of the alternatives.
The chair of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, otherwise known as FERC, posted on LinkedIn and criticizing spending on transmission lines. While he did not mention MPRP specifically, he did say, quote, transmission should be built to serve consumers with reliable power at least cost, not to serve special interests and policy agendas. Despite the pushback, developers of the transmission line are gearing up to start surveys on private property. Fox 45's Jessica Babb has a look at the latest developments.
With the Maryland District Court making its decision.
It's just very upsetting that somebody else has more rights to my property than I actually do.
Letting Public Service Enterprise Group, the developers behind the debated transmission line on people's private property.
Very emotional for us.
Residents living along the route, like Raina Gover, are getting these letters saying PSEG and its approved contractors plan to start non-invasive environmental and land surveys in the coming weeks.
Heartbroken, I guess, is the best word to describe it, that somebody can come on your property and just do whatever they want, whenever they want.
While an appeal is underway, the court so far hasn't issued a ruling preventing the surveys from happening. But right now, short of the vague letter from PSEG, landowners like Gover aren't getting much info.
All I have is that they're going to post 24 hours before they come out, and it'll be sometime in the next 30 days. And beyond that, I have no idea what they are going to or want to do.
Which is why lawmakers like Senator Justin Reedy sent a letter calling for more transparency, requesting information.
This entire process has been shrouded in secrecy.
The letter saying PSEG is being less than forthcoming about the extent and types of surveys needed on private property. We asked PSEG again, when will the surveys start? And why is PSEG telling landowners to contact their agent rather than telling them which surveys are required for their property? In response, getting few answers. PSEG didn't provide a date for the surveys, but says consistent with the court order, notice will be provided at least 24 hours in advance. And they say the recent letters to landowners were intended to open a direct line of communication to a land agent that will serve as a single point of contact for the project. Friday evening, PSEG responding to the lawmakers' letter reiterating that, also saying each property will require a range of different surveys, taking anywhere from an hour to a couple of days.
We will definitely keep fighting as long as we can.
As the pushback for this project keeps growing louder and louder, with many arguing the transmission line will benefit data centers instead of Marylanders. Despite Governor Westmore voicing his grave concerns about this project, his office announcing Thursday they're putting out an open request for information to identify new interregional transmission projects to improve grid reliability.
I believe this power line project, MPRP, is a bad one. It does not help Maryland ratepayers because the power is going to bypass Maryland and go right to Virginia. But there's no question that if we don't make changes in our energy policy, we're going to have to bring other transmission lines in to Maryland from other states for the next decade, 2 decades, because we just don't have the juice right now to do all the things that we need to do.
In Baltimore, Jessica Babb, Fox 45 News.
The Public Service Commission will make the final decision on whether the transmission line moves forward. Joining me now is the chair of the PSC, Frederick Hoover. Thank you so much for joining us to continue this conversation. I know we've had several conversations about this project, and now that this application is before the PSC, you're limited in what we can actually talk about. But I want to talk about the process moving forward. We know that there is a schedule and a timeline. Can you give us an update on where the PSC is in scheduling hearings and moving forward with that timeline?
So the commission had a what's known as a pre-hearing conference where we had all the parties, the applicant and the state agencies involved in the process, along with the group representing the homeowners in the 3 counties, to talk about setting up a procedural schedule. And that would involve hearings, evidentiary hearings before the commission at its office in Baltimore, as well as public hearings out in the service territory of the 3 counties affected by the project. The applicant proposed a schedule with certain dates in it, but we decided that that schedule really wouldn't work for all the parties involved. So we have actually asked our technical staff, who is a sort of independent entity involved in the process, to sort of work with all of the parties to create a procedural schedule going forward. We gave them 30 days to sort of work through that process. That 30-day period actually expires in a couple of weeks, and so we'll see a suggested schedule, hopefully a consensus schedule from all the parties that we will later adopt.
What was wrong with the proposed schedule from the applicant?
Well, there was concern raised by the Maryland state agencies who do the in-depth analysis of the transmission project, both for the need of it and the proposed route for it, about some information that they felt they needed in order to make their analysis that they had not been provided by the applicant. And there was a concern that the timeline that was laid out by the applicant was too constricted in order to do the substantive analysis that's needed to make this decision.
Is the field studies, is that part of that conversation?
That was part of the study. So the Department of Natural Resources is sort of the clearinghouse for an examination of this project by 7 different state agencies. And so they look at a wide variety of impacts of where this transmission line would go. So there's 2 questions that the commission has to figure out. One, should this project be built at all?
Right.
And if the answer to that question is yes, then the question becomes, where's it going to go? Now, the company in its application has suggested a route that they think is the best, but that route was actually one of 10 different routes that were suggested. And one of the questions that the state agencies had was some more information from the applicant about why the other 9 weren't selected. And then beyond that, these state agencies, the Department of the Environment, the Department of Natural Resources, the Maryland Historical Trust, have specific questions about the impacts that the proposed transmission line would have on the environment, the natural resources in the area, and also historical and cultural things that are in that part of the state. So all those issues need to be examined by the state agencies before they make their recommendation to us about where this transmission line would go if in fact it gets built.
If the field studies have yet to be completed, and we know that that is being debated in court and litigated, if that is tied up in court and that has yet to happen, how can the PSC move forward with the process?
Well, we can move forward, I guess, with the initial question about whether or not the project should be built.
Okay.
Because like I said, there's 2 things that we need to decide.
Sure.
One, is this project needed? Now, the applicant and PJM, the grid that serves Maryland, have articulated that their view is this project is needed in order to assure grid reliability and resources to maintain adequate power in the state of Maryland. That's their contention, and that's their rationale for why they think this project should be approved by the Public Service Commission. There'll be other parties involved in this proceeding that will be commenting on whether or not they agree with that. Or the third alternative is there some other way to assure the reliability that we need other than just building this transmission line. And so all of those issues will be discussed within the evidentiary proceedings before the Public Service Commission. So that part of the process can probably go forward as we're waiting on the information on the specific route impacts.
I see. That whole process sounds like it's going to take just a significant amount of time just in that aspect alone. And given the information that we've heard from PJM talking about rolling blackouts and rolling brownouts by 2027, we're halfway through 2025 already. Do you believe that their timeline and having it completed by 2027 is really realistic?
Well, I mean, this is getting into the area where I can't necessarily opine specifically on it. I mean, it is their contention, the company that wants to build the transmission line along with PJM, that this in fact is necessary in order to maintain assured reliability for the state of Maryland. That's essentially an open issue before us. So I can't necessarily say whether or not I agree or disagree on that. I'm waiting actually to hear from other entities that are involved in this process, the representative of residential customers, and also my technical staff. I mean, that's part of their job, is to examine that contention and to say, yes, it's true, or no, it's not. And again, there's this third option of, well, there's maybe some other way to fix this problem other than building this transmission line.
We also heard from this story from my colleague Jessica there, talking about the open letter from the governor for a call for more transmission lines. How does that factor into just the overall need for the power in Maryland and the role of the PSC playing into approving projects and moving forward? Does the PSC play a role in that letter that the governor sent out?
Part of our process is actually, I mean, while we don't run the grid, PJM runs the grid, but any particular energy project, whether it's a power generation facility, and that power generation facility could be a fossil fuel plant. Historically, it was coal plants, then it became natural gas plants. More recently, it's been solar arrays and potentially wind turbines. But any of these energy facilities, along with transmission lines, in order to be constructed in Maryland, they actually have to get the permission from the Public Service Commission. So we're intimately involved in the approval of all of these projects. And in this past session of the General Assembly, we actually were given a new charge by the state legislature and the governor to start to examine what types of projects should be, power projects should be encouraged in the state of Maryland. So we're going to be holding a procurement process where we were looking for potential ideas and proposals on power projects in order to assure that Maryland has enough electricity to supply all the needs we have. Part of that also includes new technologies like battery storage and other new technologies that may allow for generation of electricity at one point of the day and use later on. So it's a mix of things, and so we are involved in that part of the process, which is sort of over and above this specific proceeding that we have.
There's a lot of conversation when we're talking about the MPRP is grid reliability and just the need for energy in the state of Maryland. We know that the state imports some 40% of the energy. And listening to the developers of the project will say that this is necessary for the grid reliability. And I know that in previous conversations, you and I have said that, the PSC will make sure that the PSC will do its job to make sure that the lights stay on in the state of Maryland. Is that still the plan? Sure. I mean, is that still the goal, even if this project still takes a long time and this process drags out and is litigated year after year after year and extends beyond the timeline that we're hearing from these developers?
And so there's a wide variety of entities that are involved in making sure that power is provided when you flip the light switch in your house. It involves not only state entities like the Public Service Commission, but also involves the local distribution companies, and beyond that now, the people that create power, the power generators, whether they own fossil plants or whether they own renewable facilities. PJM, which is the grid that oversees all that, has been charged with by the federal government to manage and make sure that there are adequate resources. And they actually had well, they're actually going through it this week too, but they had a test of it, just a couple weeks ago when we had that sort of extended heat wave. And so they were able to meet the needs that were demanded by when the temperature was really, really hot and it was really humid and everybody was running their air conditioners. PJM hit a new power grid, which is how much power they were putting out. They hit a new peak on that, but they were able to meet their responsibility. So everybody takes this job very responsibly, and so we all sort of play our part in making sure that there are reliable resources brought on through whatever method is needed to make sure the power is provided to the customers.
Do you believe that in the application process and in the conversations and the rhetoric surrounding MPRP that there's a bit of almost fear trying to be infused in people in the state of Maryland that if this transmission line isn't built, we're going to see a blackout in the state of Maryland?
Well, again, I mean, that's kind of getting too close to the issues related to the substance of the process. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion, both by the people who think the transmission line should be built and the people who think it shouldn't be built about consequences of either thing happening.
Right.
The Public Service Commission needs to sort of take all into account and make the correct decision. I mean, building a transmission, I will say this, I mean, building a transmission line is one of the most significant infrastructure projects that can be undertaken for the energy system in the state of Maryland, just because of the size of it, but also the cost of it. I mean, this is not an inexpensive proposition. And so we need to make sure that if this line is in fact the solution, we need to make sure that that's the proper way, and then try to figure out a way to mitigate the impact of where it goes if we decide that it has to be built. And it's something that the Public Service Commission has been doing for 100 years. So.
And so you said that earlier that, the 30-day, the timeline for when we could see the next schedule for the next step for the application process. That's coming up by the end of July-ish?
More,
roughly?
yeah. I mean, we issued an order as a result of our pre-hearing conference to give 30 days for the parties to try and work this out. So within that time period, so probably the beginning of August, we'll have another hearing where we'll get everybody together and find out if they made any progress. Now, when push comes to shove, I mean, the Public Service Commission will set the schedule.
Sure.
If the parties can't agree to some consensus of schedule, we'll just put something together based on what's needed in order to make sure that the analysis is done right. I mean, that my primary concern is that we have this long-established process for evaluating projects like this. This is not a brand new thing. It's something we've been doing for a long, long time. But I want to make sure that the process is followed, which means that the applicant needs to provide the information to the state agencies in order to do their analysis. They need to make their studies about what the project will do and where it might go and the impacts it would have on it and what things can be done by the applicant to maybe mitigate some of those impacts. And then all of that information comes to us, and then we make a decision as to, yes, you can build it, and here's how you have to build it, or no, let's do something else, or no, it's just not needed. So.
Perfect. All right, well, PSC Chair Hoover, I appreciate your time and your insight as always. Obviously, this is a conversation that we will continue and a topic